Dr. Sheila Lakshmi Steinberg is the director of the Institute for Sustainability and a full professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at California State University, Northridge. Sheila, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yes, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So, to start, could you tell the audience a little bit about your sustainability journey and how you've come into this work?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I've kind of a unique background. I lived in a lot of places around the country. I was born in Wilmington, Delaware. My family in the urban area. We moved to Arizona when I was like 3, and we were out there in the late 60s, early 70s, and then we moved to Connecticut. So I grew up in a bedroom community of New York City. Then we moved to Southern California back in the early 80s. So this diverse experience with different geographies really led me to think about people and place quite a bit and environments because in all of these different places I live, sometimes desert, sometimes rural, sometimes suburban, you got a different sense for how people are living. Um, and so my journey began from that. And I also, my grandfather from Kentucky owned a farm as he got older. And so I was very interested in the farm that he owned in the rural areas. And then I'm half Indian. So my other relatives are in very urban Mumbai, which at the time was called Bombay, and we would travel there a lot to see them, and I would see the overpopulation. So I think that, and the environmental sort of the bad air, and it raised the impression for me that you really have to be cognizant of your environment and the people and places. And as a kid I'd think like, well, why do I have it so good in the US where I live and my relatives in India do not, environmentally?
Yeah. Well, so can you talk about how your definition of sustainability has evolved over time and what is your current definition of sustainability?
Sure. So, I was an environmental studies major at UC Santa Barbara and a communication studies major. And, in those days, they would kind of break up the study of environment into the physical environment, the social environment, right? And I was always more drawn to the social environment, but I learned a lot about the physical environment too. Then I went to UC Berkeley. I was in the forestry department, and I focused on natural resource sociology, and people would laugh about that and they go, oh, haha, what are you doing? Are you looking at the way the trees talk to each other? And but up there I studied environmental protests, and I got a master's of science and wildland resource science. Then I went and got a I went to the Peace Corps. I'm a US Peace Corps return volunteer from Guatemala. I was there from 91 to 93 doing watershed management and tree planting, and I taught at a university. So, you go over to these countries where people are farmers, they live with the land every day, and you're coming in as a Peace Corps volunteer and you think you know so much, and you go there and the people who live there know so much. And so that was a good lesson for me about the power of local knowledge. Then I went and got a PhD at Penn State in rural sociology. So that's kind of my evolution has always been focused on people and environment, people and nature, but the way I got my education has varied in different places. And, when I started in this field, sustainability, the first Earth Day was only in 1970. So when I started in this field, sustainability wasn't really talked about that much. But I'm happy to say it's talked about a lot more now. So, yeah.
So how would you define the social side of sustainability or social sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. What I'm trying to do with my new role as the director of the Institute is to really heavily bring in the role of people and place, to bring in the importance of culture, and to highly value and embrace the power of local knowledge. Because I feel like the old view of sustainability was, oh, it's how well can we recycle, right? And all the issues like carbon neutrality, like mobility, transportation, micromobility, those all, every environmental issue involves people. So I'd say it's definitely had a shift more towards the social. So thinking about social sustainability, I really say that should be part of our general definition of sustainability. And for me, sustainability means, establishing resilient communities um, globally, because people are not, people have to have a way to earn a living. There has to be there have to be jobs. People have to have food. People should live in a clean environment, but we know that The wealthy often are privileged to live in a clean environment, not hazardous environment, and the poor often suffer and live in those environments. And so, to me, it's about let's empower and engage with our local population. So it's really focused on the community because I feel like that localized piece sometimes gets forgotten as we think about implementing, let's say, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Oftentimes the policy comes very top down, but there's a big role for communities and local knowledge that I think has been kind of left by the wayside. So I'm trying to raise that up and evolve it more.
Yeah, it reminds me of the quote, is it think globally, act locally?
Yes, yes,
And
that's a great quote.
the I'm curious if you can describe more the notion of a resilient community and what that looks
Hmm.
like. I think you described some of the characteristics like food and jobs,
Hmm.
but can you dive a little deeper into
Hmm.
what resilient communities could look like?
Sure. Resilient communities, and I have a book out on this with my husband called Resilient Communities Across Geographies. It came out in 2021 with Esri Press. But really, it's about, and that's a collection of stories about communities who've been empowered through using this technology called GIS, Geospatial, Geographic Information Systems. So, a resilient community is one that can experience change, can experience a shock, it can be economic, it could be an economic change, an environmental change, and they can respond and they can keep going, right? So when we think about resilient communities, the economics are a really important part of that. I look a lot at extreme weather and what happened. I've done some books on that. When you look at what happens to communities that are hit with extreme weather, their industry falls down, their safety falls down. Maybe the water is bad. They can't live there anymore. They have to move. But a resilient community is one that, look, I live in Los Angeles. We just had the huge fires back in January, and it destroyed so many people's homes. And we're looking at now, is LA resilient? We'd like to think that we are, but are we providing housing? Are we going to rebuild? Are the same people who lived there before going to be able to come back? There's threats to community in terms of when the prices go up. So a resilient community can respond and react to change and come back. But to be a resilient community, you have to have solid community conceptually, engagement, people working together, right, to solve a problem.
Yeah. You also mentioned local knowledge when doing this
Hmm.
work. What is local knowledge, or how does it manifest? What are you talking about when you say local knowledge?
So probably this point came home to roost for me the most when I went to Guatemala and I was in a remote rural village in Jutiapa, Guatemala. And I went there like, "Hi, I'm from the Peace Corps and I'm going to do forestry with you and watershed management." They're like, "Great." And they were nice to me, but they couldn't even really understand my Spanish. So, but they're like, "Great, okay. Why'd you come here? But great." They didn't say that, but they're like, mm. So, it's really about how do we understand people in place. So you first have to try to understand what do people know? And you know this, we all are from somewhere. In every community, there's people who know something, they interact with the land. I used to live up in Humboldt County. The loggers, the environmentalists, the farmers, the people who are the dairymen, the dairy women, the people who are out there every day interacting with the environment, the guys who work on the power lines, they all know about the environment because they're out there every day living in it. And so I think we often make the mistake in our society to say it's only people with degrees who know something about the environment or letters after their name, right? Scientists, quote unquote. But really, the people who really know what's going on are the people who are in that environment and who've lived there for a long time and they've experienced it. So my movement has always been in my passion and my work has been to use multiple methods to bring in the voices and the knowledge and to document it of local people and include that with, let's say, quantitative data, secondary data, to tell a story about people in place and ultimately to impact policy. But if we leave out the local knowledge and local voice, we're just going to have a bunch of experts who they know what they know, but they don't necessarily know what's going on the ground. And you need that understanding and knowledge. We see it a lot with the Native Americans, American Indians, and how their knowledge from a long time ago. The Latin immigrants have this knowledge of trees and you know, there's certain every group has people in your family have local knowledge, but how often do we stop to think and ask and document and engage? And so that's really what I push for a lot with my work.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned within these resilient communities that you talked a little bit about like the economy and jobs and thinking about, what happens, for example, after extreme weather events.
Mhm.
How do you think about preparing for the long term around like workforce development and jobs when we don't fully understand the industry that is going to exist in 10 years or 20 years?
Right. I think I think education needs to experience a shift, and it's happening in some innovative places, but I think we really need to think about skills-based learning, creating those buckets of skills. And they're there, the kernels are there in higher education, but sometimes they're not really called out in an obvious fashion or overtly. I think the role of certificates, micro certificates is huge for for upskilling people, for boosting our adult learners, for boosting our students to say, so in a future employer can say, well, what skill sets do you have? I know you have a college degree, but what does that mean? So really being able to break out, the critical thinking is really important. The communication is number one. It doesn't matter how smart you are if you cannot communicate or answer a question or engage with people, nothing's going to happen. So this valuing those analytical skills. I mean, understanding data and critical thinking about data, because now we're surrounded by data. I have a Apple Watch. It's tracking all my movements. People sleep in beds that track their movements. There's so much data. How do you wade through it and know what are you going to do about that data? Okay, I see what's going on. I see there's drought. I see there's wind. Maybe there's going to be a fire. What are you going to do about that data? So, teaching our students those data and analytical skills and then translating that into action, those are all very important. Critical thinking and action based, and then how to get jobs to work with their hands, right? In the energy field, there's lots of opportunity. My institute's doing a lot with wildfire resilience, and we need people to get out there and to work with the land and the environment. People who too can get out and rebuild communities, but they have to understand the environment to be able to be sustainable in the rebuild here in Los Angeles after the fires.
Yeah. Well, so how does this work translate to things like policy making and like the work that different sectors and organizations do? How does this change the way we think about decisions and making policies and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think, when I teach my students, I always have them come up with some sort of a policy brief or some sort of action. I say policy is really action. It's like, what are you going to do about it? What are you doing about it? Right. And there could be a homeless issue and you come up with a policy to help deal with that. It's making decisions, but informed decision making that's inclusive, that empowers the local people, that has the voice of many different people in the community. That takes time and effort. It's easy to just talk to the experts, but it's often harder to talk to the people who are there, on the ground experiencing it. So policy, I think good policy comes from good, robust, interdisciplinary data that draws from a variety of sources, being the experts, yes, but the local people 100% for sure, but that takes longer sometimes to find. And so having those engagement sessions as we look at sustainability and resilient communities and workforce development, that's all really important because like our students know what they need, but they're not necessarily impacting the policy at my university. But luckily, my university is we serve the middle class. We serve people who actually need to get out and get jobs. So we're trying to provide the students with those active skill sets so they can translate into the workforce of tomorrow.
Yeah. So just thinking about the other side of that, the what is the role of individuals? And you mentioned your students. How do you think about, or how do you encourage them to engage in meaningful ways that help advance sustainability in their communities or in the work that they're doing?
I just finished a really interesting class called Environmental Geography, and I took my students on a lot of field trips to go see different geographies, different environments in the local region. Sometimes we were in the cities, sometimes we went out to remote, more mountain areas. And then I said to them, they were working in teams. Identify, we live in the San Fernando Valley, and one of the missions for my institute is to help to create the sustainable San Fernando Valley. But a big part of that is telling the stories of people in place. And so I said, you're going to get out there, use multiple methods to find out and tell the stories of different unique aspects of people in place throughout the San Fernando Valley. I said, the Olympics are coming. The Super Bowl's coming. We've got the World Cup coming to Los Angeles. We're going to have a big influx of tourists. They don't all need to go to Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood. They need to come out and see the valley, but there's not a lot written about that. So we are trying to document that local knowledge, and they did. They did a great job telling the stories using visualization maps. We use a product called Story Maps from Esri, and it really tells a compelling story about the restaurants, the people, and where they're located across train stops, because the train is a big way we commute and the metro in Los Angeles. So I said, people can know when they get off at the stop here, there's like some mom and pop restaurants, or some interesting unique features, environmental features. So that was a real pleasure to do that. And we just wrapped that up. So that I can send you some of those story maps if you want to see them.
Yeah, that would be great. And just kind of pulling on that thread a little bit more, what do you think is uh, the importance, or what do you think is so effective about storytelling that helps advance these conversations and advance sustainability?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's I call it geospatial storytelling because it's really storytelling tied to people and place and geography. And what makes it, a story is powerful. And as we grow up, we all have like family stories, right? That kind of say who we are as a family. Every group has its stories, right? Friend groups. And so I think about it a bit like a sociologist, like, well, what makes community? People, there's some glue holding people together. And the stories of the San Fernando Valley, one of my students said it best yesterday. They said, when you look at, because they gave a presentation, when you look at the San Fernando Valley, you think, oh, it's kind of a mishmash of a lot of malls, a lot of concrete. There's really no pattern. It's a lot of, it's like an urban jungle. And then, but then when you dig in and you start analyzing and looking at the data and identifying the locally owned establishments and the cool environmental spots and the history of how we were in the movie industry and the history of how we were big in the film industry and the history of the Valley Girls, then you start to understand the culture. And so it's drawing out the culture, telling a story, tying it with the environment, and showing that to say, hey, this is a special place. It might be a shopping mall called the Plant now, but you know why it's called the Plant? Because it used to be the General Motors plant, right? And so it's a reuse of environments, you know? And so it's just interesting how to me it's fascinating how communities transition, and you look at a place and on its face you go, I don't know, I don't really know about the valley. And that's what made me take that challenge to go, no, the San Fernando Valley rocks. It's cool, but we got to tell that story. I grew up not too far from here, back in the 80s, and I'd always be like, yeah, I would come to the valley for fun. But it's like, but a lot of people in LA kind of look down, oh, the valley, so we're like, no, we're going to tell that story, tie it to environment, tie it to sustainability, tie it to people in place, and get people motivated to ride the rapid transit, to ride the trains, to do micromobility and stop and engage and support local businesses. That sort of ties in back to that economic argument as well.
Yeah, you mentioned the culture and the notion of this special place. What do you
Hmm.
think are the things that are the what in the built environment or in the storytelling or in the history makes a place special or makes a place a place?
That's a great question. Um, you know, I think what makes a place special is the engagement that happens there, the social interaction that happens there, with the environment. Um, and it's a spatial component. And as different people come in and out and there's demographic shift, those geographies, those buildings, they often stay the same, sometimes they change. So sometimes that local knowledge about the environments and the people in place gets lost as one population moves out, as we have demographic shift coming in. But I feel like when places, it ties in with, like, people say, oh, urban sprawl, right? That's not very environmental. But then let's look at what's here. Let's look at the green nature that's here. Let's look at the energy use that's here. I mean, we're a very sustainable campus. Like, we're number one in the whole Cal State system. There's like 25 campuses and we're number one for what we do with sustainability. Like, when I go to work, there's 90 chargers that I could plug into. I have my pick. So it's really about, let's tie that to people in place. What is that? There's stories everywhere. We all have them. The town you came from, you have special things and memories that happen in certain places. Same for everywhere. But we need to, like, as environments change and as we lose our green space, it becomes very important to document and say, well, what was there, right? Could we bring some of that back, right? Could we do some tree planting to help with the urban heat island effect going on, right? But we need to understand what it was historically to be able to look at the future. And I think that's a big thing I try to do also, because people are passionate about their places, their communities. But to do that, you have to take time to talk to them. If you just drive through, oh, no, I don't like this place. But you start talking to people, you're like, oh, that's fascinating. Oh, your restaurant is like 50 years old and it was run by people who came to this country from somewhere else, and you guys have helped the local community through your, it's a centerpiece of the community. Those are the stories I like to tell. And how are you helping the environment, you know?
Yeah, you mentioned the future, and I'm curious, what is the future of uh, your work and also this work
Yeah.
generally look like?
So that's a great question. And I see it being sort of an intersection between a lot of my work on weather, climate change, uh, workforce development, and trying to empower our students with, you know, excellent skills so they can go out and get jobs. And including in that, of course, is let's prepare them for environmental industries that are out there. We know the car industry, like Southern California, especially the San Fernando Valley, there's a car culture here. So because there were many plants that produce cars, let's take the knowledge of the culture of people who've worked in these plants from the past with their hands and try to transform that into maybe the green energy, the new vehicles, the new charging stations, the new let's take the local knowledge that people have about their trees and how they grow fruit on the trees and how they share that fruit with each other in their communities. It's almost like, I'm not saying it's subsistence, but it's definitely, let's bring gardens into people's yards and that would benefit the community. Let's put more trees. So it's sort of like going back to age old practices. And every culture, people like trees. In every society, people like, they have something going on with the environment. But as urbanization tends to spread, sometimes that gets lost due to urban development. I'm saying let's bring that back. Let's look at the local traditions of the people who are there. What would what would they want to do? What kind of tree would they want to see? Don't judge them and say you're not environmental. Look at something that you could embrace local culture to achieve sustainability. And that's really my goal for our institute, is to look at that.
That's amazing. And I really like that vision for the future. And yeah, it's exciting to think about that work. But Sheila, thank you so much for taking the time to share your work and your insights and your wisdom. And I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
Yes, most definitely. Thank you so much, Joe.